This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. Joining me here today, I have Dr. Kate Clancy from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I realize I've never said that name out loud.
And yet you did it perfectly.
Okay, good. I was like, what if it's some wild pronunciation? Welcome to the podcast. I'm so deeply excited to have you on. I got your book for Christmas. It's called Period, The Real Story of Menstruation. And I read like 3 pages and I emailed you because I was like, I'm obsessed with this woman. Like, I want to be her best friend.
Aw, that's so nice of you.
And I've been talking to everyone like nonstop about it. I've been talking to my friends. I've been talking to my coworkers. I talked to a random Uber driver the other day. Like, people, I will not stop. Oh, and I talked to my gynecologist about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like literally every single person. Listeners, I don't know if you've caught on. I think you should buy this book and read it. It's just so good. But sorry, very long way of saying thank you so much for joining us. And I'm so happy to have you here. My first question is why a lot of your career has been about studying periods. You've done many other things as well. You're a very impressive person. And I'm a little bit nervous talking to you.
I'm about to underwhelm you, so don't worry.
I literally don't think it's possible. Why do you study periods? Like, what prompted you in your career to say periods is what I'm interested in?
Before I got to periods, I thought just menstrual cycles generally were really cool. And I was lucky enough my sophomore year of college to take, as part of my major, I was a biological anthropology and women's studies major in college. And we had to take like an upper level seminar. And for some reason, I decided to take it my sophomore year, which was really earlier than I should have. I wasn't actually trained well enough to be ready for the class, but I took it anyway, sophomore spring, and was obsessed with it. It was taught by Dr. Susan Lipton. And she has this very sort of straightforward way of teaching. And yet just the information was so mind-blowing to me. And I think mainly what was so amazing to me in that moment was, I didn't come from, my parents both were college educated, but sort of they were non-traditional students. Like, my dad off the GI Bill as a Vietnam War vet. My mom basically, several years after graduating high school is when she started sort of paying her own way to get a college degree. So was not, an 18-year-old doing her thing, but instead they were in their late 20s. And so I certainly knew education was important, but I didn't have anybody in my family with like advanced degrees. I didn't know what a professor was. I didn't know what research was. And it was my first exposure to this idea that you could have a career where you study things that you actually find interesting. And before that point, I thought you get in a career to do something ambitious, to achieve, like achieve. So I wanted to be a doctor because that seemed like an achievement-oriented discipline, which I think says something about our medical profession in terms of who ends up there, but that's a whole other conversation. And really, that was what got me started, was actually that seminar was so moving. And it was such an amazing idea that I was like, wait, what's the ovaries do what now? Like, it just was so much fun. And in particular, it was exposing me to this idea that, before that point, all I really knew about menstrual cycles, aside from like what we learned in sex ed about basically a 28-day cycle and ovulation and all the kind of stuff, were the ways in which people were mocked around them. So, I'm older than you, and I came up in the 80s and 90s, and if I expressed, I don't know, an emotion, what normally happened is someone accused me of PMSing. If I was angry or irritated or whatever, it was like, oh, are you PMSing, or are you on your period? I mean, that was just like expressing an emotion was a way of getting, you got teased or bullied or attacked basically for having a feeling. People close to me as well as people at school. And so this was the first time I had been exposed to the idea that not that the period or the menstrual cycle had like controlled you, made you monstrous, made you irritable, but instead was something that actually was responsive to and adaptive to the external environment. Like that was the whole reproductive ecology. That's what that whole field is. And that's what that seminar was. So it was the first time I'd ever really heard the opposite might happen, that like the food you eat, how much you move around, your infectious exposures, your psychosocial exposures, your lived experiences, those things actually can influence your ovarian hormones and other systems of your body. And that just blew my mind. So that's really how I got, that's a very long-winded answer, but that's what got me started. And then I did an honors thesis on a related topic. And then I just kind of kept going. I was like, I just want to keep doing this menstrual cycle stuff. And then in particular, I started leaning towards places where I noticed colleagues were kind of leaning away. So they, ovarian hormones, very done. Lots of people do that. Like lots of people at the time were studying hormones. Not a lot of people were studying the uterus. And so that's sort of what directed me more and more towards menstruation and endometrial function.
Yeah. There's a few different places in your book where you talk about things like both spite projects, like choosing to do things because people were like, ooh, that's gross. And you're like, screw you. I'm going to do this. And you're going to be flabbergasted by my brilliance, if you're me anyway. And two, the importance of like leaning into topics that make other people uncomfortable, because frequently those are the topics that no one has looked at. And one of the things that I think literally any woman listening to this show is gonna be familiar with is this idea that like we make up 50% of the population, but there's so much about women's bodies and women's health that we just don't know because no one has studied it. Mm-hmm. It just hasn't been important. We've been considered kind of like the other body, not the standard body, which is the male body, which is a huge bummer.
Yeah. And this has been true for trans men too, because not just in the United States, but in many countries, for a very long time, folks who were getting gender affirming care, the norm was to assume, oh, you must want a hysterectomy. And so that's less and less true. Thankfully, people are, if they wish, can preserve various organs that they want as they pursue gender affirming care, if that's what they want, right? Plenty of people also are like, no, I want to eat that uterus. But that is a not uncommon decision. And so, we also just had like very little data. And so, it's not just say like reproductive span women from menarche to menopause that go completely understudied, though of course that's really important. But we know so little of trans and non-binary folks with uteruses. We know so little of premenarcheal people as their bodies are developing, and very little of perimenopausal and postmenopausal people as their uterus is doing different stuff. It's not just like atrophying, right? I mean, yes, of course, it is shrinking in size as it's responding less to ovarian hormones, but there's lots of other stuff going on too, and we know next to nothing about it.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me about your book was that you are very careful in the language that you choose. And that was something that I really appreciated. You, instead of saying women, which literally just did, you chose to say things like people who menstruate, or you chose options like chest feeding instead of breastfeeding. And that was something that I noted and very much appreciated because it does remind you that there are other people in the room and it's not just this duality. And that duality is something that you also discuss in your book, that this patriarchal medical system that we're in. And part of the reason that, for example, trans men were frequently encouraged to be sterilized or required to be sterilized is because it didn't fit in the duality of male or woman. They're like, okay, sure, you can be a man, but that means you can't have a uterus anymore. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Super interesting.
Yeah.
But I wanted to actually go super basic, which is, can you explain what a period is and like what a menstrual cycle is? I think that reading your book has made me reflect on how little I have been taught about these things, and I don't know where my listeners are starting at. So let's all start in the same place.
Yeah. Well, and if we can back up one step, and if I can just say one more thing about what you noticed about the inclusive language, I also want to say, like, yes, the language that I use in that book and that I try to use generally, yes, it comes from a place of trying to be inclusive. It also, frankly, comes from a place of being precise. And I think, a lot of folks who push against the idea, it's like, no, only women menstruate, and like they get all grumpy about it. And it's like, actually, you're being incredibly imprecise with your language, because even if we were to only somehow, which would be incorrect, define women as only cis people with XY chromosomes and a certain type of internal and external genitalia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, there are, in fact, lots of women who do not menstruate. So you can't just say all women menstruate. And you'd be leaving out girls who also menstruate. And so, frankly, the more precise language is to say, if the body that I care about in that given context are those people who currently menstruate, I should use terms like people who menstruate. If it's less about whether or not a person menstruates, but what matters is they have a uterus, then I should say people with a uterus. And that language, again, I actually think it's a really great place to push people when they try to argue for, frankly, turfy viewpoints. So that's trans exclusionary radical feminist points or quote unquote gender critical points, basically transphobic points, is to say your language is imprecise. I'm a scientist. This is the precise language that I use. So, again, it is very much from a justice lens, but it's also from a precision lens that I'm using that language.
Yeah. And I mean, in anthropology, there's a lot of thinking around how using language changes the way that you think about things. And so using this language is making you not only more precise, but it's like making you consider all of the experience and not just like whatever like tiny thing you might have in your head, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. And it helps you think differently about what's the actual research question? What is the body under study? What are the questions I actually have? So when we take care with our language, this is the same thing, just in general, maybe you had that one professor who was always like, yes, but how do you define your variable? Okay, how do you operationalize it? Because there are so many times that when we make an assumption about a term and we aren't clear about it, it goes on and has its own meaning. So, I think sex is a great example, the term sex, because there are many levels of analysis at which we can create a sex category. Are we talking at the level of brain, chromosome, gonad, gamete size, genitalia? I'm probably forgetting more. Hormones, typical hormone ranges. Those are all of the levels at which one can create sex categories. And then there are different people who have different opinions about the differences of sex development that should and should not fit into male, female, or intersex, or other categories. Those are just like the three that we are most familiar with, but there's other people who consider more. So, I mean, again, like if you say, well, I looked at the sex difference, well, did you really? Because how did you measure sex? Oh, well, I measured it by asking people what their sex was. Well, how did they know what their sex is? Oh, well, somebody exclaimed something when they were born. Oh, so you mean the way they're defining sex is baby genitals?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's one way to measure sex. But so does that mean that the sex difference, the sex effect you're looking at has something to do with baby genitals? Because if not, you should probably rethink how you're measuring sex.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So anyway, I know that's you asked me about periods, and I decided to give you a lesson about my absolute OCD point of view when it comes to how we define and operationalize terms, which is something I clearly feel very strongly about.
No, that's good. That's the whole point of this. This is like for you to be able to talk about things that you care about. So perfect. Sure. We did it.
All right. So I'll tell you about periods now.
Yeah. Tell me what is a period? What's the deal with menstrual cycles?
So
it's a very big question.
Sorry. No, but it's a great one. So humans are super interesting. We are not alone in this, but we are what are called spontaneous ovulators as opposed to induced ovulators. And a spontaneous ovulator is one who has some type of estrus or menstrual cycle relatively regularly. So meaning now, as I was talking about before, our bodies do respond to environment, but we are not, and this is where I guess it's like super muddy. Again, we're making these very strong categories of induced versus spontaneous, but as I'm going to talk about it, you're going to see, oh, there's actually kind of overlap here. But I'll tell you, the way people typically mean these two categories is a spontaneous ovulator is one who does not require a particular stimulus in order for ovulation and endometrial receptivity to happen. So for us, it tends to just keep happening, provided we have sufficient energetic resources, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas an induced ovulator, and there are a number of mammals that do this, they have to have either penetrative sex or the presence of semen and the chemicals in semen to stimulate the ovaries to then produce an egg and for the endometrium to become receptive to potential implantation. So we don't do that stuff. We just are we're a bit more like ready to go, again, provided we have enough energy. So first there's this endometrial cycle where the endometrium, the lining of the uterus, grows and differentiates. And then for reasons that this is the part that people have lots of fights about, then at the end of the cycle, so one, we have an end of the cycle, and two, we do something with all that extra tissue, which is we menstruate it out. People have a lot of questions about why we have all this effluent and why we're such copious menstruators. The main thing is just we need a lot of tissue, and we need to create a pretty defined and differentiated tissue architecture in order to do the really extreme implantation that we tend to do, and the really deep placentation, and the very close parental embryonic contact that we tend to do. And that is a multi-week process to, well, it takes days, many days to grow and then differentiate that tissue. And then it takes weeks and weeks once the embryo is there to produce the right conditions for the placenta and allow placental growth to happen, and then for the placenta to even come online. And a number of things have to go right, most of which usually don't, for all of that to actually happen and for you to get to, say, 10 weeks gestation. So menstruation is the stuff that people first really thought of as, I'd say in more recent scientific years, in the last couple of decades, was just sort of like this waste product as a result of the fact that we had to have this cycle. Because, a tissue can only kind of stay good for so long before it's kind of funky and you can't keep using it. I mean, we slough off our skin, we renew our cells in the lining of our stomach, we're growing our hair constantly. In some ways you can imagine the endometrium is going to have to be the same way. It can't just sort of support a perfectly timed, perfectly receptive endometrium indefinitely. It's going to have to periodically restart. But menses itself is not just waste, it turns out. It's not just this byproduct or consequence of the fact that we require cycles. So there's a couple of things going on. One is that menstrual fluid itself has healing cytokines that contribute to the repair processes of the next menstrual cycle. So all that effluent that you're sloughing off with all that tissue and lymph and blood and all this kind of stuff, it actually is hanging out in your uterine cavity for a bit before it comes out. When it's doing that, it's actually contributing to the growth and development of that, little baby endometrium that hasn't started to grow yet. And so that's a very important thing that menses itself does. The other important element of this whole cycle, and again, not just the growth of the tissue, but the loss of the tissue, is that whole cycle is really good practice for us for a potential pregnancy. So we have some indirect evidence that people who've had a number of endometrial cycles are at potentially lower risk of something like preeclampsia, which is a really dangerous hypertensive condition of pregnancy that we know seems to come at least partially from kind of like an incomplete invasion of the placenta. So it doesn't embed as deeply. And there's reason to suspect that the reason it's not going as well is the architecture of the endometrium is maybe not as robust. And so then that whole process doesn't go as well. So you want loads and loads of practice. If you're going to use that endometrium for pregnancy, it needs to have loads of practice. And that's really what menstruation helps us do.
Yeah. Before reading your book, hadn't really thought about the menstrual cycle as a story of like inflammation and immune function and healing. Mm-hmm. And that's absolutely what's happening. I think, honestly, before I read your book, I hadn't really thought about my period other than like as an inconvenience.
Which it also is. It's like, we don't have to be all like, ooh, it's so wonderful to have cycles that align with the moon. Like, I'm not precious about it for sure.
No. I literally have talked to like so many people about my IUD in the last week. And I love my IUD. I love not getting a period, mm-hmm. which is also something that you talk about in your book. Your book is so complete. But no, I hadn't really thought about like how much is going on when in terms of like immune function that has to happen, like, because you're shedding like a whole layer of skin and you're ejecting it and then you're like regrowing everything and you're not mm-hmm. dying while you do it, which is crazy. Super cool. The human body is mm-hmm. so neat.
It really is.
That's why biological anthropology is so cool. So I think one of the things that you talk about quite a bit, trying to decide if I want to talk about energetics or if I want to talk a little bit about normality. And I think I want to go in the normality direction first, which is that mm-hmm. you have an entire chapter about how we have come up with this idea of a normal period, which is like a 28-day cycle, and it lasts 7 days and it's super predictable. And if you talk to a woman or are a woman or know any woman, you perhaps have noticed that is not most people's experience. Mm-hmm. But we have this idea of like this normal, and yet most people fall outside of it. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. And again, I'm going to nerdily back up even from there a tiny bit and say, before we started saying there was such a thing as a normal, part of this comes from, frankly, the eugenic origins of a lot of science and statistics. Unfortunately, there are eugenic origins to anthropology, gynecology, a lot of measures we use today in human physiology like BMI. And part of it comes from this an original idea of a normal distribution. So the normal distribution was the statistical measure that was initially come up with in order to reconcile what happens when you measure the same thing a whole bunch of times, which is an understandable thing. Like people observe that like, oh, if we measure the width of a tree trunk or the circumference of a tree trunk, let's say 10 times, we get 10 slightly different numbers. And we need some way to understand, well, what's the correct answer here? And what's the range of variation of our possible correct answer? So you take one thing measured a whole bunch of times and you get a mean and a distribution, or like a standard deviation, right? Then people started using it not as one thing measured a bunch of times, but a bunch of things measured once. And that in some ways is kind of where the problem began, because then we started to say all these different beings or traits or individuals or whatever it is that was under study, we're now going to find a mean for all these different things rather than a mean of a bunch of different measures of the same thing. So already we are risking creating something that doesn't exist, right? Because if you measure a whole bunch of things, like I'll give you an example that I often give, which is in Poland, we recruit people between the ages of 18 and 44. So we try to do a really wide age range, to be as inclusive as possible for our study. But really, because of the fact that there's ovarian hormones and stuff that we're studying, we can't really include people who are on hormonal contraception, lactating, or pregnant. And they have to be at least 3 months away from having done any of those things. So in that population, that is largely a Catholic population, so hormonal contraception, not as much of a concern, but lots of babies.
Yeah.
Lots of people having babies. Then there is a big hole in the middle of our sample, no matter what we do. There are always people late 20s into early 30s that we have almost nobody in that range of that full 18 to 44 range. So it's what's called like a bimodal distribution. We've got like two humps if you look at that distribution. But you know what our average age is of people in that study? It's like 31. I don't think we have a 31-year-old in that study. And of course, that's an extreme example, right? You can have much more different distributions that you have at least some presentation all the way across and get a mean and still recognize that it's wrong, even without that extreme example. So you go from there to now we're using normal distributions to understand people's illness like health and disease, right? So you go to the doctor and they're worried you might be diabetic. So you do like a fasting glucose test and you get your number alongside that lab's, which varies from lab to lab, that lab's range of normal. And so you're told if you are within that lab's range of normal of what they find. And I've talked to people who've said, yeah, so when I lived in Boston, I was considered normal range for this variable. And then I moved to the Midwest and all of a sudden I was out of range, even though my number was about the same. And it was because whatever sample that lab drew from was slightly different. And they suddenly were found to be unhealthy when before they'd be considered to be healthy. So you can see how something like a menstrual cycle is going to be subject to this same problem, right? This idea that there is one way that it is done. We have collected a whole bunch of measures and produced a mean, produced an average appearance menstrual cycle, and we've decided what healthy means. And healthy means you're always ovulating, and healthy means you're always within this range of what the mean is when we sample very widely. Well, I should say widely from a very specific sample of people. And so then we end up with producing this idea of what a menstrual cycle is that doesn't actually match what a menstrual cycle is. So for one, in a bunch of samples of free-living people not on hormonal contraception, up to 30% of the people at any given time are not ovulating. Not because there's anything wrong with them, not because they're infertile, just because nobody ovulates every cycle.
Yeah, which I also didn't know.
Honestly, it's not, even as someone who studies this and as someone who knows that, there is something about actually being exposed to it or like looking at your own data and finding a whole bunch of folks who didn't ovulate that you're like, oh, right. There's nothing wrong with these people. They just didn't happen to ovulate this time,
Yeah.
It is typical and expected for you to not ovulate every cycle. It doesn't necessarily even mean that you are under some incredible stressor. Like it is just not an expected thing for the body to always be firing perfectly on this extra system we have, right? We don't need this system for digestion, for cardiovascular health, for breathing. Like the stuff that keeps us, our uterus is amazing, but it probably does not keep us alive, right? So like first our body is concerned with all this like keeping us alive maintenance effort. Reproduction is extra. So like it makes sense it's not going to function perfectly all the time. It's not going to function like at the absolute top of its game. And yet what we call healthy is a reproductive system that is constantly functioning at absolute full capacity. And that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. 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 I was speaking to someone and they were shocked that I chose to get an IUD when I said that one of the reasons I got it was because I love not having my period anymore. And she's like, oh, well, I would never feel comfortable with that. I'm like, okay, that's totally fine. And I was like, can you tell me a little bit about what your period's like? And she told me that it lasts 3 days and is super light. And I was like, mine lasts 10 to 12 days. I was spending a third of my life bleeding.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a relief to not have to think about that anymore and like not plan my life around it. And again, that's not for everyone. Everyone is completely different. But actually what I wanted to say is you gave me the perfect segue into energetics. Thank you so much. One of the things that your book touches on, you have like these 3 kind of main meaty chapters in the middle that talk about things that affect your period. And the big 3 in my view, after reading your book, are energetics, the immune function, and psychosocial stressors. Mm-hmm. We've talked quite a bit about like life history theory on the podcast. I think that it is worth, oh my gosh, I'm also like now thinking about Rose Frisch and like all of the things that you said about Rose Frisch. And I was like, sorry, let me back up because no one knows who Rose Frisch is. Well, a lot of people probably don't know who Rose Frisch are who are listening. So the idea is that energy can affect, like your energy balance can affect whether or not you're having your period. And I think that this is like a pretty commonly known idea, especially amongst girls who do sports. This idea that if you are exercising too much, if you have a negative energy balance where you're not taking in enough calories, your period might stop. And that's now called RED-S.
Mm-hmm. Relative energy deficiency in sport.
Yeah. And that I think is a very common idea, but I hadn't really thought about the experience of women who have a very highly positive energy balance. So people who are getting a lot of calories and who are often by the medical establishment kind of, what is the word that I'm looking for? Criminalized is not it, but that are pathologized. Thank you so much. That is exactly the word I was looking for. Pathologized for being fat.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how energy balance can affect periods? I know I just gave like an overview, but can you go into it a little bit more deeply, please?
Yeah. I mean, what's really frustrating is absolutely energy intake, so what you're eating, and energy expenditure, how much you're moving around, both play a role in how much energy you have available, right? And that's just one of a bunch of different ways we could talk about energy. There's energy balance, energy availability, energy status, energy flux. And then sometimes you can get into the weeds where, weightlifting versus cardiovascular things, eating higher fat versus higher carb, like the actual composition of what you're eating or what you're doing matters. But just in a very basic way, let's just say we're thinking about a seesaw, right? And like energy in, energy out matters. So especially and I'm going to use the term women here because I think it's actually relevant because right now we're talking not just about people who menstruate, but the social category of woman and how people think about women, which is, especially white women who are often put as a pedestal as a way of encouraging them to continue to support white men and try to rely on the proximity to power you get by getting to be up close next to white men and ideally being protected from some harms while, of course, still experiencing tons of others. So we always think somehow white supremacy is going to protect us. Guess what? It doesn't protect you as much as you think, but that's a story for another podcast, right? So we've got this social category of women, maybe some of them have dreams of getting the vote or getting an education or, riding a bicycle. These are all things that various women have wanted to do in the past. Middle class and upper class white women, I should say, because women from lower socioeconomic classes, women of color, immigrant women, enslaved women, they were all doing hard labor, moving their bodies and living their lives, without this being a contentious, oh no, what will this do to the women fear, right? So this is really about fears people had about white women and whether white women were going to continue the eugenic project of pumping out lots of white babies. So there have been a lot of contrived fears around movement and that negatively affecting reproduction that have since largely been debunked. What's important to think about here, though, is that the grain of truth is that certainly if you are not providing enough energy to your body, it is not going to function optimally in all systems at all times. And reproduction, again, being the non-life necessary thing, it's going to be one of the first things to sort of experience some kind of decline in functionality, which is why we see ovarian hormones dip or other things start to happen if you're experiencing more expenditure than expected. Here's the thing, though, is most people, and our systems are created very smartly. If you start moving around more, you get more hungry, so you eat more. So for the most part, people who move around more, they eat enough to support their movement. The problem is that, another thing, again, the reason the term woman here is important, because we're talking about a social category that has been acculturated a particular way. The reason this continues to be a problem for women, though, is that women have been taught that we have to keep our bodies a certain size, that we're not supposed to pay attention to hunger cues, and that we have to, to be hungry, to eat large amounts is disgusting. And again, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I grew up in heroin chic and everyone loving Kate Moss.
Oh, yeah.
And, that was still very much a thing I'm old enough to now say, the turn of the century. Body positivity was definitely not a thing when I was growing up, and it certainly wasn't a thing 100 years before that when these kinds of conversations were happening. So the problem is that you do see some people experience reproductive suppression, some women, because they don't eat enough to support their activity. And this doesn't mean that they are anorexic. You see subclinical eating disorders. You see people who are just restricting in ways that they don't even recognize are harmful. And you see this across a range of weights. Because one of the other very harmful things we think is that our body size is a one-to-one correlation of how much we eat and how much we move around. And that is not true. People can be extremely restricting their food and be of a variety of body sizes. And so they can be experiencing reproductive suppression because they are not eating enough to support their movement.
Yeah.
Then you look at I'm sorry, this is so long.
No, you're totally fine.
Quickly say, the reason this is such an interesting thing to me, or something that I harped on a couple different points in the book, is that we do a lot of hand wringing about these poor women who are experiencing suppression and doing all these things like riding bicycles and getting educated and wanting the vote, and how that's taking up all their energy, and they're going to, their poor little uteruses are going to wilt. But the thing is that it's like the harm is coming from not eating enough. The harm is not coming from the movement. And I think we have to really pay attention to that. I think the other thing is we tend to worry because of the fact that all of this is actually about fat phobia. We tend to wring our hands a lot more about larger bodied people than smaller bodied people, that they're doing bad things, they're doing bad things for their health, that they're harming themselves, that they're going to be infertile, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the impacts on reproduction of being larger bodied in general are much less than the impacts on reproduction of being smaller bodied and restrictive in the food that you're eating.
Yeah.
So these assumptions that we make that like energy surplus or, because again, it's not one-to-one correlation, and or being in a larger body are harmful, are largely overblown, whereas we don't actually pay enough attention to the fact that we encourage women to constantly regulate, ignore hunger, and energy restrict is actually a much stronger explanatory force for reproductive suppression.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, again, one of the things that impressed me about your book is how relatable it was. And as I was reading through each section, I literally noted down the names of women that I was like, I see this woman in this particular section. I think I'm 35. So I also got that like full skinny is beautiful, blah, blah, blah. And I also participated in a sport where thinness was valued.
Mm-hmm.
I like very distinctly remember a coach saying to me, if it's down between you and another girl who's thinner, the judge is going to choose the thinner girl. it looks better.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I'm so sorry.
No, yeah. I mean, it's as a 35-year-old that's done a lot of therapy, I can look back and see how messed up it was. But like in the moment, I was like, it was a person in authority like telling me that this was the reality and I needed to change my body as a result. The good thing was that I was never that good at the sport, so no one invested that much time in me.
I had similar experiences in dance when I was young. And I think that's what motivated me switching over to like basically violent sports, is because in dance, we constantly got yelled at if we were perceived as too big. My size, I was told my legs were too big. And then I also was mocked for having body hair. Because when you're in puberty and you finally start growing like armpit hair,
yeah,
I don't know. It took me a while to figure out, I guess I should start shaving that. And my leg hair was so fine. I didn't really have any. And yet, because I wasn't shaving, I got teased mercilessly for my leg hair. And so like those were my strongest memories of dance, is not enjoying dance. My strongest memories are the teacher being so furious that she had some kind of pointer she would point at our bodies with, that one time she broke a ceiling panel because she gestured so wildly because she was so pissed at us about something. Like that's my memory of dance. So it's no surprise that eventually I started playing basketball, soccer, rugby, and then roller derby, because I think I wanted to hit somebody.
Yeah, I'm fair. I think a lot of us feel the same way, frankly. Mm-hmm. I do want to like touch on some of because you're a biological anthropologist, this biological anthropology podcast, I do want to touch like very briefly on some of the work that you do, just to kind of highlight it. There's like so much stuff that I wish that we had time to talk about, but you mentioned that your work in Poland, looking at women and hormones and just kind of like trying to understand the cycle and like how different factors affect fertility and menses. One of the things that I did not like really think about until I read your book, this is also relating back to energetics and also your project, is that people do not menstruate the same amount of times over the course of their lifetime, which obviously energetics can play a role in it, but also like obviously being pregnant, if you're not taking birth control and you're pregnant, you're not getting your period. And I had never really thought about like, I will have my period or I would have had my period so many more times than someone else. It's mind blowing. And then there's also all these like different cultural like reactions, cultural approaches to periods that are very different. Strongly recommend anyone who's interested in all of this to read the book. But sorry, your project in Poland, can you talk a little bit about that? How you got started working in Poland, and what you're kind of working on now, if that's okay?
Sure. There was, because I wanted to work on understanding endometrial function, I initially wanted to do stuff on menstruation, and it seemed like I was not going to have success doing that at the graduate level. There were reasons that people didn't believe that menstruation was that important. And so we decided that endometrial function would make more sense to study, since that was important. Yeah. You can read my face. But anyway, at the same time, it was obviously great training, and I'm very happy with the dissertation that I did, even though of course there's a million things I wish I had done better. I mean, it wasn't, we all regret whatever we were able to collect in grad school. But the reason I got started working in Poland was the place I originally wanted to work, they did not think would be a great location, given that what I need to do to study the endometrium is on the invasive side. So I need to do transvaginal ultrasounds in order to measure endometrial thickness. And that's understandable. Like if you've ever had one, there's a wand that has to be inserted. And if you have a good sonographer, they hand you the wand, you insert it yourself, and then it's very long. They use the end of it to kind of just move it gently to see what they need to see. And it's not a horrible experience. And in fact, research has shown that people anticipate it being more uncomfortable than it is. But that doesn't still make it a walk in the park. Like, people don't love it. Yeah. And of course, if you're going to a place that doesn't have a ton of hospital infrastructure, how are you going to do an ultrasound, right? So Poland was sort of this great, sort of perfect in-between place where, one, I had a wonderful collaborator, the director of the field site of the Mogielica Human Ecology Study Site, Grażyna Jasienska, who welcomed me with open arms, despite me being at the time initially like an absolute know-nothing 22-year-old. Who barely could say hello and how are you in Polish initially. And, she allowed me to go work where she did her collection. But the area we work was very rural, south of Krakow, not too far from the Czech border, actually, or too far from the Ukraine border, actually. And, folks, for the most part, were living fairly farming, farmy type lives in the early 2000s when I got started. And so they were working on the mountains. They couldn't really do things. They had to mostly do things by hand or with horses. They didn't have a lot of heavy machinery. And there were a lot where I did some of my early collection, most folks had family farms. As time has passed, this has slowly changed, and some of these farms are becoming not family owned. Some people are not farming anymore. Things have really, just in the 20 years since we started working there, I guess 23 years since I first went, that place has undergone a lot of change. But initially, that was a really great reason to go. It's like there's a hospital down the street. There's a doctor with a private practice with an ultrasound machine who's willing to be our collaborator. We kind of had a good setup there where we were able to kind of get the support we need, but also be working with a population that is not just sort of like an urban American sedentary population, but one that engages differently with the land, therefore having different exposures, right, to the air and to plants and to soil microbes and things like that. They have different amounts of energy expenditure because of the high effort of the harvest season. It was just a great place to go in order to not do what so many human physiology studies do, which is study a bunch of healthy 20-year-olds that all happen to be near a university.
Yeah.
As an anthropologist, that's what we like to do. We like to make sure we capture human variation in all its forms.
Yeah, that's the whole point. I do want to be really respectful of your time, and I know that you have another meeting to get to. So I'm going to get to my last questions that I ask on every show. The first question is, if people would like to learn more about your work, where is a good place for them to start?
I think the main ways to, learn about my work. I mean, I think the big one is read my book.
Yes.
You can learn. I talk a lot about my research there and about the research of many, many other people who I think are loads smarter than me. So I think my book is the best place, and I have a paperback now, so it's even cheaper. And if you like audiobooks, I narrate my own. But the two other main ways you can find me are on Blue Sky, and I have a button-down newsletter. So I do not use Substack for various transphobia reasons.
Yep.
And so I've got a button-down one, and it's pretty easy to find. So those are the two that I would recommend.
Yeah. And then one of the things I also wanted to mention is that one of your advisors was Peter Ellison.
Mm-hmm.
And I've recommended his book on the show a few times, which is On Fertile Ground. So if you want another more kind of reproductive ecology take, that's a classic in the field.
Yep. He was my undergrad advisor.
Yeah. He seems so cool.
Really sweet, wonderful guy.
Yeah. Second question, what are you reading for work right now?
For work, I just had to return my emotional support interlibrary loan.
I'm so sorry.
And I finally had to buy a copy because I kept renewing it. And then they finally were like, got to give it back now. And that was a book by Erica Vanderslipt called Wasted Womb. And it's on pregnancy loss in Cameroon. And oh my gosh, it's just a beautiful, again, it's for folks who read ethnographies, but it's a really beautiful book. The other book I'm reading right now is by a colleague here in gender and women's studies, Mimi Huynh. And the name of the book is The Promise of Beauty. And it's a really smart, really gorgeous treatise to help us think about these bullshit times that we live in.
Yeah. Yeah. And the last question is, what are you consuming for fun right now?
For fun, I am back on the train of borrowing hardcover books from the library. I kind of go on and off from trying to go work through my own library as well as or ebooks or whatever. But I just got I've been meaning to read Max Gladstone for forever. Aside from the book he co-authored about the Time War, This is How You Lose the Time War. And so I'm reading 3 Parts Dead right now. It's the first book in a series, and I'm really enjoying it.
Oh, cool. Also, listeners, she has a really cool chapter or section on speculative fiction at the end of the period book. So if you want some more recommendations, you can buy the book and read it. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you and the book that you've written, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show is produced by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.